No, I think you just do it. I did Dr. Faith for the same reason I did the first record. Just kind of the love of the craft, and just love what we do.
At his peak, Christopher Cross had it all figured out. In a single night, he etched his name into Grammy history, becoming one of the most decorated artists the industry had ever seen. But almost as quickly as it began, everything started to slip. And the man who once ruled the sound of a generation found himself quietly pushed aside, his voice fading from the spotlight. But even that wasn't the most heartbreaking part of his story. Years later, he would face a devastating health crisis so severe it nearly took his voice, his hands, and the life he had fought to rebuild from scratch. And now, the way Christopher Cross lives today is utterly heartbreaking. The rise of Christopher Cross. In 1981, a soft-voiced former drummer from San Antonio walked onto the Grammy stage not once, but 4 times, collecting every major award the music industry could give in a single night. No artist had ever done that before. No artist has done it since. The man holding those trophies was Christopher Cross, and at that moment, he seemed destined to dominate popular music for a generation. However, almost as soon as the success came, it vanished. And now, a recent health crisis has changed his life in ways that no amount of awards could have prepared him for. The boy who would become Christopher Cross was born Christopher Charles Geppert on May 3, 1951, in San Antonio, Texas. His father was a United States Army pediatrician stationed at Walter Reed Army Hospital, a posting that brought the family into contact with the highest levels of American power. At one point, the elder Geppert treated President Eisenhower's grandchildren. That proximity to prestige did not translate into stability for young Chris, because military families move often, and the Geppert household moved with the same frequency as any other. Home changed every few years. Friendships formed and dissolved. The only constant was the uncertainty of where they would live next. Christopher was raised Catholic, and the structure of that faith gave him something to hold on to during the relocations. But what truly held him was music. He loved Buddy Holly and Richie Valens, the rock and roll pioneers who died young and left small but perfect bodies of work. He also loved the jazz pianist Dave Brubeck, whose complex rhythms and unusual time signatures planted something in Cross's musical brain that would not fully bloom until his own records. In the 7th grade, he received a drum kit, and he played it with enthusiasm in a band called the Psychos. The drums gave him a role, a purpose, and a way of being useful to a group. That feeling of being necessary, of contributing to something larger than himself, would eventually drive him for decades. Surprisingly, when he reached high school, Christopher shifted his focus to the guitar after he discovered that the instrument was better suited for songwriting. The drums allowed him to keep time, but the guitar allowed him to shape melodies, to express something interior, and to become a creator rather than just a participant. He also developed an admiration for Frank Zappa, especially for his instrumental approach and rhythmic innovation. Cross wanted to make music that was sophisticated without being cold and accessible without being dumb. It was a difficult balance that most artists never find, but Cross found it. In his teenage years in San Antonio, he met 2 musicians who would later become lifelong collaborators, the bassist Andy Salmon and the keyboardist Rob Muir. The 3 played together in various configurations, learning each other's instincts and building the kind of chemistry that only years of playing together can produce. In 1971, Cross joined a hard rock group called Flash, a band that opened for Led Zeppelin, Jefferson Airplane, and Deep Purple. These were big stages for a young musician, and the experience taught him how to hold an audience's attention when he was not the headliner. He later relocated to Austin with his bandmates, and added a drummer named Tommy Taylor. Together, they played cover songs for income while recording demos at Odyssey Sound, a studio that would later be renamed Pecan Street Studio. Austin, in the 1970s, was becoming a music town, but it was not yet the polished festival destination it would later become. It was still rough around the edges, and Cross and his band were part of that roughness, playing long nights for small crowds and hoping that someone from a record label would walk in. Thankfully, someone did. In 1978, Warner Brothers signed him as a solo artist, even though the band had a collective identity, and the other members had contributed significantly to the sound. The label saw something in Cross specifically: his voice, his songwriting, and his ability to convey a kind of wistful, yacht rock melancholy that was just then coming into fashion. They were right to bet on him. His self-titled debut album, Christopher Cross, was released in 1979. It contained 3 songs that would define his career. The first was Ride Like the Wind, featuring Michael McDonald on backing vocals, a song about escape, speed, and the desire to outrun everything. The second was Never Be the Same, a quieter meditation on loss. The third was Sailing, a song so dreamlike and weightless that it seemed to exist outside of time altogether. That song would become his signature, though he would spend the rest of his life trying to escape its shadow. The album stayed on the charts for more than 2 years and achieved platinum status. Cross worked with Don Henley, J.D. Souther, and Nicolette Larson, surrounding himself with the best session musicians and songwriters of the era. The sound he created, a polished blend of soft rock, pop, jazz, and adult contemporary, was not to everyone's taste, but it was unmistakably his. Then came the Grammys. In 1981, he became the first artist in history to win all 4 major categories in a single year: Album of the Year for Christopher Cross, Record of the Year for Sailing, Song of the Year for Sailing, and Best New Artist. He also won Best Arrangement Accompanying Vocalist. No one had ever swept the top categories like that, and no one has done it since. A year later, he co-wrote Arthur's theme Best That You Can Do with Burt Bacharach, Carol Bayer-Sager, and Peter Allen. The song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Both Sailing and Arthur's theme reached #1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. At 30 years old, Christopher Cross had achieved more than most musicians achieve in a lifetime. But then, almost as quickly as it had arrived, it all began to fall apart. The tragic decline of his career. Christopher Cross had just won more Grammys in one night than any artist in history. He had followed that achievement with an Oscar for a song that became an instant standard. He had 2 #1 singles and a platinum album that refused to leave the charts. And every sign pointed toward a long and steady reign at the top of popular music. However, that reign lasted barely 2 years before the industry changed around him. And the same voice that had won 5 Grammys suddenly could not get played on the most important new platform in music. The year 1981 was supposed to be the beginning of a long and prosperous career for Christopher. Instead, it turned out to be his peak. Everything that followed would be measured against a standard that was probably impossible to maintain. Cross released his second album, Another Page, in 1983, and it featured singles like All Right and Think of Laura. The latter song found an unexpected second life when it was played repeatedly on the soap opera General Hospital after a character died. Millions of viewers who had never bought a Christopher Cross record suddenly became familiar with his voice. But familiarity is not the same as commercial success. While the album was moderately successful by normal standards, it did not match the impact of his debut album. The sales numbers were lower, the radio airplay was lighter, and the momentum that had carried him through 1980 and 1981 had shifted in a different direction. The single biggest reason for that shift had nothing to do with Christopher Cross, and everything to do with a cable channel that launched in August of 1981. MTV changed the music industry within months of its debut, and it changed it in ways that no one could have predicted. Before MTV, radio was the primary gateway to popular music, and a song could become a hit based solely on how it sounded when heard through a car speaker or a kitchen radio. After MTV, a song needed a video, and an artist needed to look a certain way on camera. The industry stopped asking whether the music was good and started asking whether the face fit the frame. Christopher Cross did not fit that frame, and he knew it even if he did not say so publicly at the time. He was not ugly, and he was certainly not untalented, but he did not look like the rock stars that MTV was putting into heavy rotation during the early 1980s. Music industry insiders described him as not having the rock star look, a phrase that sounds vague but carried real economic consequences. He was older than the new wave and metal acts who dominated the channel, and his appearance was softer and less dramatic than what the camera seemed to want. He looked like a thoughtful, slightly awkward musician from Texas who happened to write beautiful songs, and that was not enough for a medium that rewarded spectacle over subtlety. He tried to adapt to the new reality, because he had no choice if he wanted to remain visible. He slimmed down, shaved his facial hair, and attempted to present a more polished and camera-friendly version of himself. But the visual culture of the era was not interested in small adjustments, and his efforts at transformation did not work. The industry wanted artists who looked like they had been born for the screen, but Cross looked like he had been born for a recording studio, which is exactly where he belonged. His music, which had been praised for its sophistication and craftsmanship just 2 years earlier, was suddenly overshadowed by performers who thrived in the video era. Artists who knew how to move across a stage, how to dress for a close-up, and how to smolder into a lens without seeming self-conscious. The sales numbers told the story of his decline more honestly than any interview ever could. His song, Think of Laura, peaked at number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, a respectable position but nowhere near the dominance of his earlier hits. When he released Every Turn of the World in 1985, the decline accelerated noticeably. That album failed to chart significantly, and the same thing happened with the next album he released in 1988. By the late 1980s, Christopher Cross was no longer a mainstream chart presence. He went from performing in arenas to performing in theaters and then in clubs. The emotional toll of watching his career fade was significant, though Cross rarely spoke about it publicly at the time. He has since admitted that he felt sidelined by an industry that had celebrated him as a genius and then discarded him as irrelevant within the span of a few years. The thing that hurt most was not the loss of money or fame, though both of those losses were real. What hurt most was the feeling that his talent had been rendered invisible by forces that had nothing to do with music. He had not stopped writing good songs, and he had not lost his voice or forgotten how to arrange a melody. He had simply become unfashionable in an industry that prized fashion above almost everything else, and that realization was difficult to accept for a man who had been told repeatedly that his music was timeless. He described the experience as deeply discouraging, and he watched his career fade while the critical acclaim remained intact. Fellow musicians still respected what he could do with a guitar or a melody, and the Grammys still hung on his wall. But the machinery of popular culture had moved on, and it did not look back. Cross kept working through all of it, and he never stopped making music, even when the commercial returns diminished with each release. But the gap between his artistic output and his commercial fortunes grew wider with every passing year. The man who had swept the Grammys was now playing smaller venues and selling fewer records, and he watched younger artists take the spotlight that had once been his. He did not become bitter, at least not in public, but he became quieter about his own achievements and more private about his disappointments. And then, just as he was beginning to accept that the best years of his career were probably behind him, his personal life collapsed in a way that made the career decline look like a minor inconvenience. Chris's turbulent personal life. While Christopher Cross watched his career fade through the 1980s, his private life was unraveling in ways that the public never saw. The same years that brought him Grammys and an Oscar also brought him a divorce that coincided almost exactly with his professional peak, and the marriage that followed would last nearly 2 decades before ending quietly, leaving him alone to raise 2 children while still carrying the weight of a career that had never recovered its momentum. The first marriage began before anyone knew his name. Cross married Roseanne Harrison in 1973, a time when he was still playing cover songs in Austin clubs and recording demos at small studios in the hope that someone from a record label would eventually notice him. She lived a private life, and little public information exists about her career or her background. The details of how they met were never documented, and the couple seems to have preferred it that way. The marriage lasted 9 years, which is a significant stretch of time by the standards of the music business. But the divorce came in 1982, a moment that could hardly have been more difficult in terms of timing. Cross had swept the Grammys in 1981 and won the Oscar for Arthur's Theme in 1982, and he was supposed to be celebrating the highest achievements of his professional life. Instead, he was navigating the end of a marriage, while also trying to manage the sudden pressure of being the most awarded artist of his generation. The emotional strain of the divorce added to the industry pressure he was already feeling, and it left him starting his second act as a solo artist and a single father almost simultaneously. For several years after the divorce, Cross focused on his music and avoided any serious romantic entanglements, at least publicly. Then, in 1987, he met a woman who would become his second wife and the mother of his 2 children. Her name was Jan Bunch, and she was born in 1965 in Oxford, North Carolina. She worked as a makeup artist and entrepreneur, a profession that kept her somewhat connected to the entertainment industry without placing her directly in the spotlight. They began dating in 1987, and the relationship moved quickly by the standards of someone who had been through a painful divorce just a few years earlier. On May 14, 1988, Cross and Bunch married in a private ceremony attended only by close friends and family. The wedding was small, deliberately so, and it reflected a desire on both their parts to keep their personal lives separate from the machinery of fame. For nearly 2 decades, the marriage appeared stable from the outside. They had 2 children together, a daughter named Madison Cross, born on March 3, 1992, in Santa Barbara, California, and another child named Rain Cross, born in 1994. Cross was now a father twice over, and he seemed to have found the domestic stability that had eluded him during his first marriage. But the marriage ended in 2007 after 18 years together. The reasons for the divorce were never disclosed publicly, and both Cross and Bunch have kept the details private, which is consistent with how they handled their relationship from the beginning. An 18-year marriage does not end lightly, and the decision to separate after nearly 2 decades suggests that whatever problems existed between them had been building for a long time. The divorce was finalized quietly, without the kind of public acrimony that often accompanies the end of a celebrity marriage, and Cross did not speak about it in interviews for years afterward. After 2007, Cross did not remarry, and he has remained single ever since. He focused his energy on his music career and on raising his 2 children. The end of his second marriage added another layer of isolation to a life that had already been marked by professional disappointment and industry rejection. He was no longer a young man, and he was no longer a superstar. And now he was alone in a way that he had not been since his early 20s. The separation from Jan Bunch meant the dissolution of a long-term family unit. And for a man who had placed so much of his emotional investment in that family, the loss was profound. He continued to record and tour, but the engine that had once driven him seemed quieter now. He was a father first and a musician second, and the children became the center of a life that had once been centered entirely on the next hit song or the next album. By the time he emerged from the aftermath of his second divorce, Christopher Cross was in his late 50s, and he had been through 2 failed marriages, a career collapse, and years of industry neglect. He had 3 children from his 2 marriages, and he had learned to live without the kind of romantic partnership that most people take for granted. But worse things were still coming, and the health crisis that would change everything was waiting just a few years down the road. The health crisis that changed everything. In early March of 2020, Christopher Cross flew to Mexico City for a concert, the kind of performance he had done hundreds of times before without giving it a second thought. Masks were not yet widely used, and the idea of a global pandemic still seemed like something happening to other people in other countries. He came home with a fever, and within weeks, he was lying in an intensive care unit, paralyzed and unsure whether he would ever walk again or play the guitar that had defined his entire career. Cross contracted the respiratory virus during that concert trip to Mexico City, and shortly after returning, both he and his girlfriend, Joy, tested positive, right in the middle of the global pandemic. The initial illness hit him harder than anything he had experienced in his 68 years of life. He suffered through 3 weeks of severe symptoms, including extreme fatigue and a deep malaise that made it impossible to do anything more than lie still. He later described it as the worst illness he had ever had, and he said that at one point he could not even lift his head from the pillow. The situation worsened significantly when he was hospitalized and placed in the intensive care unit. He was paralyzed, unable to move his limbs, and unsure from 1 hour to the next whether his body would continue to function. He called those 10 days the worst of his life and described the experience as the darkest of times. He admitted to having what he called come to Jesus moments, praying for survival in a way that he had not prayed since he was a child. He made a promise to himself that if he recovered, he would try to be a better person, though he did not specify exactly what that meant or how he planned to measure it. Just when he thought he might be getting better, something worse emerged. In April of 2020, after feeling slightly improved, Cross collapsed at home. His legs simply gave out beneath him, and he could not stand back up. He could not walk at all. Doctors ran tests and delivered a diagnosis that explained the sudden paralysis: Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder in which the immune system, having been triggered by an infection, begins attacking the body's own nerves. The syndrome is believed to have been triggered by his respiratory infection, and it added a devastating second layer to an already brutal illness. The symptoms came fast and without mercy. His legs and hands were reportedly paralyzed, which was frightening enough for anyone. But for a guitarist who had built his entire career on the dexterity of his hands, the paralysis of his hands was something closer to a death sentence for his profession. He could not turn over in bed without assistance, and he could not move independently at all. He experienced severe nerve pain, numbness, and weakness in his limbs, sensations that made sleep almost impossible. The medication prescribed to manage the nerve pain caused speech difficulties and a persistent memory fog, which meant that even his mind did not feel like his own anymore. Doctors described his condition as touch and go, a medical phrase that sounds casual but carries enormous weight when applied to a specific human being lying in a hospital bed. The ICU stay lasted approximately 10 days, though Cross later said that time had become meaningless to him because every day felt exactly like the one before it. He was trapped inside a body that would not obey his commands, and he had no way of knowing whether the paralysis would be permanent or temporary. The recovery process has been slow and incomplete. He was initially confined to a wheelchair, unable to move from room to room without help. He later regained the ability to walk with a cane, which felt like a victory, even though it was a victory with obvious limits. He still experiences fatigue and a neurological fog that descends without warning, and his speech is sometimes affected when the nerve pain medication interacts with his system. The doctors told him that most Guillain-Barré patients recover within 6 to 12 months, but approximately 20% face long-term problems that never fully resolve. Cross has admitted that his recovery slowed significantly after the initial progress, leaving a cloud of uncertainty over whether he will ever feel like his old self again. He has described the entire ordeal as life-changing, a phrase that is often overused in celebrity interviews but seems entirely appropriate in his case. He felt obligated to share his story publicly because he wanted to warn others about the risks of the disease. He has since spoken openly about the paralysis, the fear, and the long months of rehabilitation, not because he enjoys reliving the trauma, but because he believes that silence helps no one. What he has not discussed as openly is what the health crisis did to his finances, his sense of security, and the modest but functional life he had built after the decline of his career. The medical bills were enormous. The tours he had scheduled were canceled. And the man who once swept the Grammys found himself facing a future that looked very different from anything he had imagined. The financial fallout and where he is now. The truth of Christopher's current situation reflects a lifetime of professional highs, industry neglect, medical catastrophe, and the slow, steady income of songs that refuse to die. Touring had become a major source of revenue for Cross, especially during the resurgence of interest in yacht rock throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Audiences who had grown up listening to Sailing on their parents' radios were now filling theaters to hear those same songs performed live, and Cross had built a comfortable living around those performances. His illness in 2020 forced cancellations of multiple tours and reduced his ability to perform live, cutting directly into his active income at a time when he needed it most. The medical costs from his ICU hospitalization and long-term rehabilitation were substantial, though he has not disclosed the exact figures publicly. He continues to face ongoing expenses for nerve pain medication, physical therapy, and mobility support. Those recurring bills have changed the way he thinks about money, and they have made him more dependent on the one source of income that does not require him to leave his house. His primary income has shifted almost entirely to royalties from his debut album and Arthur's Theme, both of which continue to generate payments every time they are streamed or played on the radio. Streaming platforms and the renewed interest in yacht rock have provided steady, though significantly smaller, revenue streams than he enjoyed during the heyday of physical album sales. As of 2026, his estimated net worth by various websites sits between $11 and $15 million, a figure that places him slightly below Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins, but above other peers from his era. His real estate portfolio in Santa Barbara, California, represents his most significant asset. He lives in Santa Barbara now, focused on his family and his ongoing recovery. He performs occasionally, but not at the pace of his earlier career. And he has not officially retired from music, even though health limitations mean he must be selective about when and where he plays. Despite his reduced visibility, Christopher Cross remains a respected figure in the yacht rock canon, and his Grammy and Oscar achievements continue to define his legacy in ways that no health crisis or industry bias can erase. He is a man who survived the brutal machinery of fame, the collapse of his career, the end of 2 marriages, a near-fatal virus, and a rare disorder that stole his ability to live his normal life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.